The room was filled with the beeping of machines and the faint smell of antiseptic, but what cut through the haze more than the pain in my chest was the silence from the people I thought would care most. I had survived open-heart surgery, something that could have easily ended my life. And as I lay in recovery, the question that haunted me was simple. Who will pick me up when it's time to go home? It wasn't just logistics. It was about belonging, about being seen, about not having to face the weight of recovery alone. I typed carefully into the family group chat, hands trembling from weakness. Who will pick me up from the hospital? A plea, but wrapped in hope. After all, I had a wife of 45 years and a son I had raised with everything I had. Surely they would want to bring me home, to show me I still mattered. The reply came quickly, too quickly, as if he hadn't given the question a second thought. My son Scott wrote, "Call a taxi, I'm watching TV." No hesitation, no concern, just indifference. I read the words 3 times, praying I had misunderstood. This was my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, coached through Little League, sacrificed dreams so he could have his own. And now, the best he could offer was to let a stranger's cab carry me home from my hospital bed. Before the wound of his words could close, another cut came sharper and deeper. My wife Susan, the woman I had stood beside through decades of shared history, sent her own message. "Stay in the hospital for another month. It's so good without you." That wasn't a joke. It wasn't lighthearted sarcasm. It was cruelty dressed in casual language. And it shattered something inside me more completely than any scalpel ever could. I put the phone down slowly, my body trembling not just from surgery, but from betrayal. I had been technically dead for 47 seconds during that operation, suspended between life and nothingness. And now, in the hours of my most fragile recovery, I felt like I was truly dying. Not physically, but emotionally. What was the point of surviving if the people I lived for didn't care whether I came back? The irony was unbearable. For decades, I had been the dependable one. When Susan had her appendectomy, I was the one at her bedside, hand in hers, making sure she felt safe. When Scott broke his arm as a child, I rushed him to the emergency room, never once thinking of myself or my comfort. Yet here I was, abandoned at my most vulnerable, discarded like an inconvenience rather than cherished as a husband and father. And then came the twist of fate no one could have predicted. That evening, while my family relaxed comfortably at home, perhaps still laughing about their cruel messages, the local news carried a story that would shake their world. There on the television screen, under the harsh glow of studio lights, I spoke calmly about what had happened. The surgery, the abandonment, the cruel texts, the story of a man whose own family left him to fend for himself. Back at my house, Scott and Susan must have sat in stunned silence as my words played across their television. They heard their exact phrases quoted, not in a private chat, but broadcast to the entire city. "Call a taxi. Stay another month. It's so good without you." Words that they had typed carelessly, now etched into public memory. That night, as the segment aired, my phone began buzzing with a vengeance. Scott and Susan called again and again, leaving message after message. "Dad, it's Scott. Call me back." "Buford, this is insane. Call me immediately." But I didn't answer. 67 missed calls lit up my screen, desperate voices from people who had ignored me when I needed them most. They had chosen comfort over compassion, indifference over love. Now that their inheritance, their reputation, and their future were threatened, they suddenly found the time to care. But it was too late. Something inside me had shifted permanently. Their betrayal had turned into my clarity. Their rejection had become my liberation. And for the first time in 45 years, I realized I had the power to walk away, not just from the hospital, but from a lifetime of being taken for granted. This was the beginning of justice, not revenge. Justice for a man who had given everything, only to be told he was worth nothing. That morning, I was a husband and father begging for a ride home. By that evening, I was something else entirely. A man ready to reclaim his life, no matter what it cost. The pain struck like a lightning bolt, splitting my chest in two. One moment I was drifting in uneasy rest, the next I was choking on air that felt too thin to sustain me. My eyes flew open to a harsh white glare above, sterile light that pierced my skull. My body screamed with every twitch, every attempt to move. Tubes and wires pulled at me like restraints. My chest felt as though someone had pried it open with a crowbar and left it patched together with tape. A calm voice broke through the chaos. "Mr. Thompson, you're awake!" I turned my head with effort. A woman in a white coat, glasses perched gently on her nose, stood beside me. Dr. Carter, my cardiologist. Her eyes were kind but steady, eyes of someone used to holding fragile lives in her hands. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though the answer was written all over me. My throat burned raw. My voice came out as a hoarse whisper, like I got hit by a truck. She nodded, checking the monitor beside me. To me, the lines and numbers were meaningless. To her, they told the story of a heart that had failed, a heart that had been forced back into rhythm. "You underwent emergency cardiac surgery 2 days ago," she explained. "Triple bypass. Your heart stopped for 47 seconds during the procedure. 47 seconds. The words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. In less than a minute, I had been gone, slipped into that abyss people fear but cannot describe. Technically dead, a void where my life should have been. And the strangest part, no one seemed to notice. I had fought my way back into this world. Machines had shocked life into me. Skilled hands had stitched my heart back together. And yet, outside those sterile walls, not a single message, not one phone call had come. My wife hadn't asked about me. My son hadn't checked in. The world had moved on without me, as if my 47 seconds of death had been irrelevant. Dr. Carter pressed 2 fingers to my wrist, counting the rhythm beneath my skin. "You're going to be fine," she said softly. The surgery was successful. 2 weeks in the hospital for recovery, then gradual return to normal activity. Her confidence was reassuring, but inside I was unraveling. 47 seconds. It doesn't sound like much, but it was enough to divide my life into 2 parts. The years before I realized how disposable I was to the people I loved, and the years after, when I would have to decide whether to keep giving myself to those who gave me nothing in return. In those 2 weeks of hospital recovery, I had plenty of time to think. The ceiling tiles became my silent confessional. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every overtime shift, every canceled dream, every time I had put their needs before my own. I thought about how I had lived for Susan's comfort, for Scott's future, and never once asked what my future should look like. And what did I receive when my body gave out, when my heart literally stopped beating? Silence, indifference. The only sounds that kept me company were the beeps of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses doing their rounds. My family didn't even bother to send flowers, let alone visit. It was in that silence that the truth became unavoidable. I had died for 47 seconds, but the real death had been happening slowly for years. Death by neglect, death by ungratefulness, death by being invisible in my own family. Survival had given me another chance, but that second chance wasn't a gift from my wife or my son. It came from the doctors who cared, from the strangers who worked tirelessly to keep me alive. It came from me, from the stubborn spark inside that refused to give up. And if I had been strong enough to fight my way back from the edge of nothingness, then maybe I was strong enough to start fighting for myself in life too. 47 seconds changed everything. I wasn't going to waste the years I had left pretending that love existed where it clearly didn't. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the blank white ceiling tiles, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering backward through the years. The silence from Susan and Scott was loud, but what hurt more was realizing it wasn't new. Their indifference hadn't begun in that hospital. It had been building, one careless dismissal after another, for decades. I just hadn't wanted to see it. It began subtly, back when I was still strong, still convinced that sacrifice was what made a family thrive. In the summer of 1982, I was 25 and full of dreams. I had finally saved enough money to buy myself a Harley Davidson. That bike was freedom to me, wind on my face, open roads, a reminder that life could be more than bills and responsibilities. But then Susan stood in our cramped apartment, bouncing baby Scott on her hip, and told me plainly, "The bike has to go. We need money for the crib and furniture." I didn't argue. I polished the chrome one last time, my heart aching as I taped the for sale sign to it. $3,000. That was the price of my freedom, traded away for duty. I told my Sherelf it was temporary, that I would buy another one later, once Scott was older and life was easier. That later never came. The years blurred into more sacrifice. In '95, we finally had the chance to take a honeymoon, 15 years late. Paris in the spring, that was our dream. I had worked double shifts, tucked money away, and carried brochures home like sacred promises. But then Scott got accepted into college. Susan sat at the table, tears on her cheeks, ripping up those brochures. "Europe will always be there," she said. "Scott's education comes first." So, Paris went into a box with the rest of my postponed happiness. Tuition payments became my new dream, one paycheck at a time. By 2003, exhaustion was my constant companion. I remember driving home after 16 hours at the plant, my hands blistered, my back aching, and collapsing into my recliner. "When do I get to rest?" I had asked Susan. She didn't look up from her television show. "When Scott graduates and gets a good job. Then we'll have time for us." Scott did graduate, but then he needed help with rent. Then with a car loan. Then with seed money for a graphic design business he swore would make us all rich. "This is our ticket, Dad. Just 6 months and I'll pay you back with interest." I co-signed papers that put our house as collateral. 4 months later, the business folded. I spent the next 3 years working myself to the bone to pay off that debt. And still, I told myself it was fine. That's what fathers do. That's what husbands do. We give and we keep giving, because one day, surely, they'll see the sacrifices and return them with love. But Susan's gratitude never came. She had her book clubs, her charity events, her circle of friends who admired her lifestyle, all funded by my calloused hands. Scott grew into adulthood without ever knowing responsibility, cushioned by the belief that his father's wallet was an endless well. Even when my health began to fail, when climbing the stairs left me breathless and dizzy, the response was always dismissive. "You're getting old," Susan said, not looking away from her television. "Maybe cut back on those weekend projects." Scott shrugged from the couch. "See a doctor, Dad, or try vitamins. Hospitals are expensive." They didn't see me. They saw what I provided. And I, blinded by loyalty, kept pretending it was enough. Then came that morning in March 23 when the first real heart attack struck. I collapsed in the kitchen, coffee grounds scattering across the linoleum as pain tore through my chest. I called out weakly, "Susan," but she didn't come for 10 minutes. When she did, she looked down at me struggling on the floor and said, almost annoyed, "Did you fall? I've got a hair appointment in an hour. Can you drive yourself to the doctor?" That was the day something inside me cracked, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. The doctors told me plainly, blocked arteries, emergency surgery needed, or I had 6 months left at most. 6 months. And the thought that chilled me wasn't the fear of dying. It was realizing that if I died, my wife would probably feel relief, and my son would only wonder how much money he'd get. All those years of sacrifice, all those dreams postponed, and for what? For a family who found my absence more pleasant than my presence. For a son who saw me as a wallet, and a wife who saw me as background noise. Lying in that hospital bed after the bypass, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been living a life. I had been maintaining one. For them, not for me. And when my heart stopped for 47 seconds, the world they built on my back didn't even notice it had collapsed. The hospital is a strange place to heal. The walls are too white, the lights too harsh, and the constant hum of machines makes silence impossible. But the greatest thing about those 2 weeks after surgery wasn't the pain or the tubes or even the slow process of learning to breathe and move again. It was the silence from the people who were supposed to care most. Every day I reached for my phone. Every day I expected something, anything. A call, a message, a simple, "How are you feeling?" But my notifications were filled with everything except what I needed. News updates I didn't care about. Pharmacy reminders, spam emails. When I opened the family group chat, the last message was from 3 weeks ago. Susan complaining that the grocery store was out of her favorite yogurt. Before that, Scott asking for money for his car repairs. That was it. Not a single word about my surgery. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, hoping I had missed something, hoping there was a hidden message buried in the noise. But there was nothing, just silence. Nurse Jennifer, kind and patient, checked my vitals one evening and noticed the phone in my hand. "Any family visiting soon?" she asked gently. I shook my head, unable to find words. She didn't press. Instead, she adjusted my IV and said, Sometimes surgery gives people time to think. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it isn't. What I thought about was how invisible I had become. 45 years of marriage, nearly 4 decades of fatherhood, and here I was, lying in a hospital bed with no flowers on the table, no cards by the window, no voices cheering me on, just empty silence. The truth began to weigh on me like another layer of bandages wrapped around my chest. Maybe Susan and Scott weren't neglecting me out of ignorance. Maybe they simply didn't care. The thought stung worse than the surgical wounds. I remembered the years when I was the one driving Susan to her appointments, making sure she never faced recovery alone. I remembered sitting in the emergency room with Scott when he broke his arm as a boy, holding his hand while he cried, promising him he'd be okay. And yet, when the roles reversed, when it was my turn to need support, both of them were silent. It wasn't just about the surgery. It was about everything it represented. Illness strips away the illusions of family life. You learn very quickly who values you for you and who only values what you provide. My wife and son had made their feelings clear, not in words, but in their absence. Some nights, I lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of nurses walking the halls, and wondered if anyone would notice if I disappeared altogether. If my heart had stopped again during those 2 weeks, would anyone outside those hospital walls have cared? That's what hurt the most. Not dying for 47 seconds, but realizing that the world I had built, the family I had held together with every ounce of my strength, wouldn't have noticed if I had stayed dead. 2 weeks is a long time to sit in silence. Long enough for denial to peel away, for excuses to fade, for the truth to settle in your bones. And the truth was this. I mattered to strangers more than I did to my own family. The nurses checked on me, the doctors encouraged me, even the janitor who swept the hallway offered me a smile and a kind word. Meanwhile, the people I loved most had vanished. By the end of those 2 weeks, something inside me had hardened. I was still weak physically, still stitched together with thread and medication, but emotionally, I was beginning to change. The silence wasn't just painful anymore, it was clarifying. If Susan and Scott couldn't be bothered to lift a finger while I lay in a hospital bed recovering from life-saving surgery, then what was the point of continuing to sacrifice myself for them? The answer was becoming clearer with each passing day of silence. There was no point at all. January 29th arrived crisp and bright through the small hospital window. After 2 weeks of pain, recovery, and silence, this was the day I had been waiting for, Freedom Day. Dr. Carter had signed my discharge papers with a smile, reminding me to take it easy and avoid lifting anything heavy. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "Make the most of this second chance." I nodded, holding the papers carefully. Her words should have filled me with gratitude, but as I sat there packing my belongings into an old sports bag, the weight pressing on my chest wasn't just from healing stitches. It was from the emptiness of knowing no one was waiting for me. I kept checking my phone that morning, 10 times, then 20, hoping. Maybe Susan had been busy. Maybe Scott didn't know when I was being released. Maybe, just maybe, there was a surprise waiting. I told myself that they weren't heartless, that perhaps they were planning something at home, that silence didn't always mean abandonment. Finally, I decided to take the first step. I typed into the family group chat, "Hi everyone, I'm being discharged today and feeling much better. Can't wait to see you all." I stared at the words, then deleted them. Too emotional. They'd think I was being needy. I tried again. "Hospital is releasing me today. Looking forward to coming home." Delete. Still too much. Third attempt. "The doctor says I can come home today. Would love to see everyone." Yes, that felt right. Hopeful, but not desperate. I pressed send and set the phone down beside me, my bag already zipped and waiting. The response came faster than I expected. My son's name lit up the screen. Relief washed over me until I read the words. "Call a taxi. I'm watching TV." For a moment, I thought I had misread. Surely, after everything I had been through, he wouldn't dismiss me with such coldness. I read it again, and again. No. There it was, cruel and careless. My son, the boy I had given up dreams for, the man whose failures I had paid for, couldn't be bothered to pause his television show to bring me home from the hospital where I had nearly died. My chest tightened, not from surgery, but from heartbreak. But still, I held on to one last shred of hope. Susan. Surely Susan would be different. We had been married 45 years. Surely she would want to see me, to bring me home herself. Her message appeared just seconds later, confirming what I had tried so hard not to believe. Stay another month in the hospital. It's so good without you. I dropped the phone onto the bed, staring at the glowing screen in disbelief. The words blurred through tears I hadn't realized were forming. It wasn't just rejection, it was cruelty. My wife, the woman I had built a life with, was telling me that my absence was preferable to my presence, that my suffering was her comfort. The morning sunlight streaming through the hospital window no longer felt warm. It mocked me. My chest ached in a way no doctor could fix. Nurse Jennifer came into the room, clipboard in hand, and immediately noticed my face. "Mr. Thompson, are you all right? Chest pain?" I shook my head silently. She picked up my phone from the bed, glanced at the messages, and her expression shifted from professional concern to quiet sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Family can be complicated." Complicated. That was one word for it. Another was betrayal. I had spent 45 years believing love meant sacrifice, that providing, protecting, and enduring would eventually be rewarded with loyalty, that when the time came, when I needed them, my family would stand by me. But here was the truth. In 2 short messages, I was not a husband, I was not a father, I was a burden they were happier without. As I gathered my things and prepared to leave the hospital alone, the discharge papers in my hand took on a new meaning. They weren't just instructions for medication and follow-up appointments. They were proof. Proof that I had survived without them. Proof that their words had freed me from an illusion I had clung to for too long. This wasn't just a discharge from the hospital. It was a discharge from 45 years of being taken for granted. The taxi pulled up to the house I had poured half my life into. White siding, green shutters, the oak tree in the front yard. It should have felt like homecoming, but as I stepped out of the cab, discharge papers still tucked in my bag. It didn't look like home. It looked like a monument to my years of sacrifice, a structure built on the illusion of family. I stood on the sidewalk longer than I needed to, staring at the place I had mowed, repaired, and maintained for decades. Every nail, every blade of grass, every brick carried my effort. Yet in that moment, it no longer felt like mine. It felt like evidence, a reminder of how much I had given to people who saw me as little more than a paycheck and a caretaker. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, but when I pushed the door open, I knew instantly that something had changed. Even the entryway felt foreign, as though I were stepping into a stranger's house. Mail was scattered on the small table by the door. Unopened bills, flyers, junk. Susan's shoes were kicked off carelessly next to Scott's muddy sneakers, abandoned where they had been dropped days earlier. The living room hit me harder. It was no longer the space I had carefully arranged, cleaned, and protected. It had become a playground. Scott's gaming equipment sprawled across the floor like an infestation. Controllers, headsets, tangled cords, empty pizza boxes balanced on the coffee table I had bought with overtime pay. Energy drink cans were stacked into a pyramid beside my recliner, the same chair that had once been my sanctuary after 16-hour shifts. My absence hadn't left them grieving. It had given them license to indulge. I moved through the house slowly, like a stranger taking inventory. The kitchen was worse. Dishes piled high in the sink, greasy takeout containers overflowing in the trash. The refrigerator, once filled with basic groceries I had worked to provide, was now stocked with expensive wine and premium ice cream, luxuries they hadn't hesitated to buy while I lay stitched together in a hospital bed. But the sharpest knife waited in my study. My space, my refuge, the room where I kept my books, my documents, my carefully arranged photographs of a life I thought was meaningful. Now, it had been turned into storage. Boxes of Susan's craft supplies buried my desk. Old computer equipment of Scott's, long broken and useless, was stacked on my shelves. Dust covered the framed photos I had placed with such care. In every corner, evidence screamed the same truth. My presence hadn't been missed. It had been erased. I lowered myself into the only chair that wasn't covered with junk and felt the full weight of the betrayal. For 47 seconds in that hospital, I had been dead. And in those 47 seconds, this was what they had chosen to do with my life's work. Turn my home into a dumping ground, a place of convenience rather than respect. That room told me everything I needed to know. My absence hadn't been a wound for them. It had been freedom. The next morning, I searched my phone for estate attorneys in Dallas. One name stood out: Jonathan Hale Associates, experienced in estate planning, specialists in charitable giving. Perfect. I dialed the number, and the receptionist answered with a polished, professional warmth. By the end of the call, I had an appointment scheduled for that very afternoon. Walking into that high-rise downtown felt like stepping into another world. Polished brass doors, mahogany paneling, quiet efficiency everywhere. It was the kind of place where decisions reshaped lives, and that was exactly what I intended to do. "Mr. Thompson," the receptionist greeted, "Mr. Hale is ready for you." Jonathan Hale looked younger than I expected. Mid-50s, silver hair, sharp but kind eyes. He gestured toward a leather chair across from his massive desk. "Please sit. I understand you want to make significant changes to your estate plan." I sat, the folder heavy in my lap. My voice was steady, but inside me, years of hurt boiled beneath the surface. "Yes, I want to leave everything to charity, nothing to my family." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but his tone remained neutral. "That's a substantial change. May I ask what prompted it?" I told him. "The surgery, the 47 seconds, 2 weeks in the hospital without a single call, the cruel text messages, the way my home had turned into a frat house during my absence." I told him about the sacrifices, the motorcycle, the Paris trip, the loans, and how every dream I postponed had been wasted on people who never appreciated it. He listened without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask, are you making this decision while you're angry? Sometimes after a medical crisis, people—" "This isn't anger," I interrupted firmly. "This is clarity. I've had a week to think about it. They do." As I stepped into the hallway, the office light seemed brighter. Behind me, Hale's office held the machinery of justice. Ahead of me, the Foundation's offices waited 3 floors down. The place where I would turn private justice into public vindication. Because this wasn't just about disinheriting Susan and Scott. This was about making sure the world knew exactly why justice in private felt good. But justice in public? That was something else entirely. It wasn't enough to rewrite my will in silence, to quietly pass my estate to a foundation. My family had chosen to humiliate me in the cruelest way, abandoning me when I was at my weakest. Now, it was their turn to face humiliation, not in whispers, but under the bright lights of the evening news. 3 floors below Jonathan Hale's office, the American Heart Disease Foundation's headquarters buzzed with morning activity. Posters of survivors lined the walls. Stories of families who had fought together, healed together, celebrated together. It was everything my own family wasn't. Rebecca Mills, the Foundation's media coordinator, met me with a firm handshake and a smile that radiated competence. Her office walls were decorated with framed newspaper clippings and awards from past campaigns. This was a woman who understood the power of a story. "Mr. Thompson," she said warmly, "your attorney told me about your donation. But I'd like to hear your story directly. Why this decision?" I told her everything. The surgery, the 47 seconds, the 2 weeks of silence, the text messages. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply told the truth, and that was powerful enough. Rebecca listened intently, her pen scratching across a yellow notepad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp. "This is powerful," she said softly. "Your story could save hundreds of lives. People need to understand how vital family." After the studio interview, the crew followed me home. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the Channel 8 van parked in my driveway. The cameras rolled as I walked through the living room, pointing out the mess left behind by my son and wife during my hospital stay. Empty pizza boxes, stacked soda cans, my recliner buried under clutter. Evidence of their comfort while I fought for my life. We sat down in the same room, the camera pointed at family photographs on the mantle, wedding pictures, Scott's graduation, vacations I had funded but never enjoyed. All symbols of my devotion, now hollow reminders of my wasted years. "Do you have any regrets?" David asked quietly. I looked directly into the lens. "My only regret is that it took me 68 years to realize my own worth." By late afternoon, the crew packed up, shaking my hand with genuine respect. "This will air tonight at 6, Jennifer promised, "and I expect it'll get picked up elsewhere." I spent the evening in a quiet restaurant, watching the broadcast on a mounted television. The anchor's voice carried the story to the entire city. A Dallas man donates his house to charity after his family abandons him during heart surgery. My face filled the screen, calm, dignified, telling the truth. Across town, I knew Susan and Scott were watching too. Watching their words. Call a taxi. Stay another month, it's so good without you. Echo back at them through the television, no longer private, but broadcast to thousands. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being humiliated. By the time I walked back into my house the next morning, the air felt different, heavy, charged. Susan and Scott were waiting for me in the living room as if they'd been rehearsing all night. Their faces were pale, eyes ringed from lack of sleep. For once, the arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. Scott stepped forward. Effie. You're home? I turned to face him fully. When did you last pay a mortgage payment? A utility bill? When did you contribute anything besides dirty dishes and demands for money? His mouth opened, then closed. No words came. The truth was undeniable. Susan tried again, her tears falling freely now. Honey, I know we made mistakes, but 45 years of marriage has to count for something. It did count, I replied, pouring my coffee. It counted for everything, until you showed me exactly how little I meant to you. She reached for me again, pleading, we can change. We'll be different now. We'll appreciate you. I shook my head. For how long? Until the next time you need something? Until I'm too old and sick to be useful again? I'm 68 years old. I don't have time to wait for you to become decent people. I sat down at the table with my coffee and opened the morning newspaper as if they weren't even there. The foundation will take possession next month, I said casually. You have until then to find somewhere else to live. Scott's voice rose again, raw with anger. This is insane. You can't survive without us. I folded the paper neatly, looked him straight in the eye, and said, I've already survived without you. Quite well, in fact. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, lighting their faces twisted with fear, disbelief, and the sudden realization that their comfortable life was gone. I stood, slipping on my coat. When I come back from my walk, I said evenly, checking my watch, I expect to see packing boxes. Dad, wait, Scott stammered. 23 hours and 58 minutes, I interrupted, walking toward the door. The click of the lock echoed through the house as I stepped outside. Behind me, Susan and Scott sat frozen in the kitchen, staring at each other with the dawning horror of people who had just learned the truth. By late afternoon, both cars were filled to the brim. Furniture, appliances, and boxes of things they couldn't carry were left behind, abandoned just like they had abandoned me. Susan stood by her car, keys trembling in her hand. Her voice cracked. I never thought it would end like this. Neither did I admitted, leaning back in the rocker. I thought you'd learn to appreciate what you had. At exactly 6 o'clock, 24 hours after I had given them their ultimatum, they pulled out of the driveway. Scott was red-faced with anger. Susan was crying, but I didn't feel sadness. I felt something closer to relief, like taking a deep breath after years of suffocation. That night, the house felt enormous. Empty rooms echoed as I walked through them, but for the first time in decades, the emptiness wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. No television blaring, no arguments about money, no demands for more, just peace. In my study, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were travel brochures I had hidden away, Colorado mountains, Arizona deserts, national parks I had dreamed of but never visited, dreams I had postponed for my family's comfort. Dreams I had buried under bills, repairs, and sacrifices. Now, finally, those dreams were mine again. February passed quietly as I adjusted to the solitude, making plans for my first real trip in decades. By March, I was standing beneath the vast Texas sky in Big Bend National Park, hiking trails my doctor would have warned me against, breathing air that tasted like freedom. For the first time since I was a boy, I wasn't working for anyone else's future. I was living for my own. The silence of that house had taught me something powerful. Being alone isn't the same as being lonely. For years, I had been surrounded by people who made me feel invisible. Now I had no one around me, and yet I finally felt seen, by myself, by Elle. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos. A modest studio apartment, clean and organized. Sparse furniture, but everything in place. It was more responsibility than I had ever seen him take. How's your mother? I asked. His expression darkened. She's learning. She got a job as a sales clerk at Macy's. Lives in a small apartment too. We don't see each other much. We're both busy working. I sipped my coffee, studying him. This wasn't the same entitled man-child who once told me to call a taxi because he was watching TV. This was someone humbled, maybe even reshaped by necessity. "Dad," Scott said suddenly, his voice dropping lower, "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm not here to move back in, or for money, or for you to change the will back." That surprised me. I had expected some plea, some manipulation. "Then what are you here for?" He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with his phone. "A chance. A chance to prove I've changed. Maybe we could have coffee sometimes like this, if you want to." I leaned back in my chair, weighing his words. He wasn't asking for restoration. He wasn't demanding entitlement. He was asking for something new, something smaller, something real. I showed him a few photos from Colorado, the snow-capped peaks, the wildflowers, the still lakes reflecting the sky. His eyes lit with genuine amazement. "I never knew you wanted to do any of this," he admitted. "I never had the chance to find out myself," I said. He nodded, understanding. "I've been thinking about that, about how much of your life you gave up for us, and how we just took it for granted." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years between us. Then I spoke. "I'm not promising anything, Scott. I'm not changing the will back. I'm not looking for a traditional father-son relationship again. But maybe we can build something new, something healthier." And Scott, well, he came back every so often. We'd share coffee once a month, nothing more. No apologies rehearsed to perfection, no promises that things would be different forever. Just quiet, simple conversations about his work, my travels, the places we'd each grown into separately. He didn't ask for my money anymore. He didn't demand my time. He just wanted a seat at the table, and for the first time in his life, he seemed to understand he had to earn it. Susan never came. Not once. Maybe pride kept her away, maybe shame, or maybe she still believed she had done nothing wrong. Either way, I didn't miss her. The woman I had married, the hopeful girl I'd once swung on a park swing, was long gone. In her place was someone who had taken and taken until there was nothing left to give. And I was done giving. I had learned the most important lesson of all, that self-respect is not selfish, that boundaries are not cruelty, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is say, "Enough." When I stood in my driveway at sunset, camera in hand, photographing the sky painted in fiery colors, I realized that the beauty of life had always been there. I had just been too tired, too burdened, too blinded by obligation to see it. The truth is, I died for 47 seconds on that operating table. And maybe that's what it took for me to finally start living. I no longer measure my worth by how much I give to people who don't care. I measure it by the joy I feel on a mountain trail, by the click of a camera capturing a sunrise, by the peace of sipping coffee in a quiet house that finally feels like mine. And maybe, just maybe, the future will hold healthier love that grows from choice, not obligation, respect, not manipulation, presence, not absence. But if it doesn't, I'm okay with that too, because for the first time in my life, I am enough for myself. The sun sank lower,